My name is Dennis Otto. I am a pastor through the AG, which you probably could tell by looking at me. I mean, Bob and I, we're the only cool pastors out there. Well, and that's pretty cool, too, and that's really cool. But I wasn't always a pastor. I was a drug addict for over 30 years. And I'm not going to talk about the drug addiction world because it's just full of misery, pain, guilt, shame, the violence, the women, all that stuff. I'm not going to talk about that because there's no glory in that. I want to talk to you this morning about what God is doing. God is still alive because that's where the glory is, folks. But anyhow, my addiction ended when the judge sentenced me to 110 months in prison. And if you're trying to do the math, let me help you out. It's 9 years and 2 months. But when the judge sentenced me to prison, truth be told, I was already in prison way before that. I just didn't know it. And when she said 110 months, I had a sigh of relief because it was about 6-7 months before that. I was a methamphetamine cook, a distributor and stuff. That's in guns. That was my charges. But it was about 7 months before the judge sentenced me to prison. I'm in my backyard with my buddy Opie. Opie's a patch holder with a 1% club, and I know you guys know what a 1% club is. Opie lived with me. I was a hang-around. I was never a patch holder. They wanted my drugs. I made really good drugs. But anyhow, Opie and me were in my backyard one night, and I'm burning garbage that I didn't want to put in my garbage. You know what I mean? And I looked at Opie, and I said, Opie, I'm tired. I want out of this life. I was in that life for, almost 30 years, over 30 years. And I said, I'm tired. I want out. And I'll never forget his laughter. He laughed at me and he goes, Dennis, men like you and me, we don't get out. We die. That's what we do. And so that's what I really thought my lot in life was, that I was going to die in that dark world. So when the judge said 110 months, I was relieved. I knew I could do the time. I mean, obviously, nobody wants to do 9 years in prison, but I knew I could do the time. So I did my time. I walked out of prison 2 weeks before my 48th birthday. And when I walked out of prison, I got to tell you, I was scared. Because I started doing drugs at 12 or 13 years old, and I never quit once until I walked into prison. So I didn't know who I was. I knew I didn't want to be the guy I was before I went to prison. I didn't want to be the guy I was when I was in prison. But man, it's tough when you're 48 years old and you don't even know who you are. Well, I was on ISR, which is intense supervised release. And one of the stipulations to that is you have to go to NA or AA. Well, I was a drug addict, so I started attending NA in Hastings, Minnesota. And I was going there for a few weeks, and one night the group went out for fellowship to Perkins afterwards, so I went with. And I'm sitting at this table, and there's this young gal across the table from me. Her name's Patty. And we're talking. Now, Patty, she was born in an all-Christian home. And when I say all-Christian, I mean nieces, nephews, uncles, aunts. Her whole family is strong Christian. And obviously, she fell away. She was at NA. She got into drugs and stuff, and she was rebuilding her life. Well, at the end of the night, and I should mention this, Patty's a little bit younger than me, like by 19 years. But I looked at Patty, and I said, you're going to date me someday. I'm kind of full of myself sometimes. But anyhow, she looked at me, she starts laughing. She goes, oh, no, I'm not. She held up her hand. She had a ring on, and she was engaged to be married. And I got to tell you, I was just out of prison, so I said, that's not going to stop me. It's just a ring. But anyhow, about 2 or 3 weeks later, my charm won her over. And that's what it was, wasn't it, honey? Just my charm? Won her over, and she started dating me. And it was about 2 or 3 months later, she becomes pregnant with my child. And that's when her all-Christian family first found out about me. I didn't get any Christmas cards that year. What wasn't there to love? I was 19 years older than her, just got out of prison. I did not know God even existed. I mean, wouldn't you want me dating your daughters? But she's pregnant with my child. Our son, Caden, is born. And after he was born, after a little bit, then Caden and Patty moved in with me. And after moving in with me, Patty started attending church again. There's something about living with me. You realize you need Jesus in your life. But she was scared to say anything to me, you know, because truth be told, you folks, I was pretty rough around the edges yet, you know, and she didn't know how I would react. Well, we're living together. We went out to eat with her family one night, and let's say her family was very cautious of me. But my son's part of your family, and it's a package deal. Where my son went, I went. Well, I'm sitting at the dinner table that night at the restaurant, and Patty's brother-in-law, Matt Longawa, is sitting across the table from me. And I could tell he's looking at me, you know, and I'm thinking to myself, dude, what are you looking at me for, you know? And all of a sudden he looks at me and he goes, Dennis, where are you at spiritually? And I must have looked at him like he had three heads, because nobody I know talks like that, you know? So I'm thinking of a smart aleck comment to come back with, like, don't you know who I am, like I was somebody, you know, or things I've done. And so I'm thinking of a zinger to come back with him, and all of a sudden I heard a voice. Now, you guys, I've done a lot of drugs, and I've probably seen one or two things that weren't really there. But I've never heard voices. And the voice said to me, said, Dennis, for once in your life, be honest. And so I was. I looked at Matt. I said, Matt, I've been living in hell my whole life. I hope when I die it's better than this. And then I sat back, because I know how you Christians are. You like to preach. So I sat back, you know, and here it comes, you know. But he didn't. All he did was ask me questions. And I could tell when he asked me the questions, he cared about my answers. He asked me once, he goes, Dennis, do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? And I looked at him, I said, Matt, I said, the things I've done, the things I've heard other people, what they've done, I said, it's really hard for me to believe there's a God out there that lets this kind of stuff go on. And then I said, if there is a God, I see good people, yet their little boy is dying of some disease, or a little girl gets hit by a car and killed. I said, if God's not there helping good people like that, I said, why the hell would he do anything for a man like me? It made no sense. Why would God do anything for a man like me? Well, Matt and me, we talked the night away. Everybody left the restaurant except for me and Matt. He gave me a ride home. And on the ride home, he gave me a book called One Heartbeat Away by Mark Cahill. Mark Cahill is a street evangelist. He's sold millions of copies of books. But in the back of the book, there was a prayer of salvation and a prayer of condemnation. And he said in the book, he said, if you don't pray the prayer of salvation, by default, you pray the prayer of condemnation. You guys, I read that prayer of condemnation like 6 times. That was my life. That's the life I've been living, was that prayer of condemnation. I wanted something different. I got down on my knees and I gave my life to Christ. Now, I've got friends that have been raised Christian their whole life. And they'll tell me, Dennis, I don't even know when I gave my life to Christ. He's just always been there, you know. I know exactly when I gave my life to Christ. It was March 15th, 2010 at about 9:20 at night, because when I gave my life to Christ, that hole I've been trying to fill my whole life with the drugs and alcohol, the women, the violence, that hole was full for the first time in my life. I felt it. I felt different. Something changed in me. I felt the love of Jesus for the first time in my life. And that was the moment I became truly free. Well, the next morning I got up and I called Matt. And I said, Matt, I did it. He goes, what did you do now? And I told him I gave my life to Christ. And he came and he picked me up. We were living in Hastings at the time. He's from living in Lakeville. He came to Hastings, picked me up, drove all the way back to Apple Valley to a Christian bookstore, bought me my first Bible. 4 days later, you guys know what Alpha is, correct? Alpha is like a training program for Christians, how, Christianity is and stuff. 4 days later, he's got me at River Valley Church in Apple Valley at celebration dinner for Alpha. River Valley is a huge church. I walk into this room, and there's like 150 people in there, and they're all nice. All of them. I'm not used to that. I'm more used to people like Troy, you know. But they're all nice. They're giving me hugs and stuff. I'll never forget this little lady came in. She was an older lady. She had pure white hair. and she's about this tall, and she's giving me the biggest hug of my life. And I'm thinking to myself right away, would she be hugging me if she knew who I was? Well, she was Pastor Rob's mom. Absolutely, she would have been giving me that hug. But even some of the guys were trying to hug me, which was pretty uncomfortable because when I was in the penitentiary, we didn't do a lot of hugging. But I liked the way I felt when I left. And so Patty and I started to go to church there. And I started to serve immediately. Folks, if you want to get plugged in, serve. There's always a place to serve. Always. And that will plug you in quicker than anything else will. Well, I started doing whatever they wanted, whether it was ushering, greeting, security, whatever they wanted, I did. Well, a short time after that, one of the pastors heard about my testimony. So he did a video testimony that played at all the campuses. And I think back then there was maybe 8 campuses. Well, right after they played my video testimony, I had people coming up to me and saying, Dennis, would you talk to my dad, my husband, my brother, my son, people that were struggling with addiction, things that I worked my way through. And so I don't want to say I started working with men way back then, but I was somebody that these guys could talk to, somebody that was not going to judge them, somebody that understood. So things are going good. Patty and I, we ended up getting married. When I was 53 years old, we had our second son. I should have read a book on that. But things are going good. We bought a house in Apple Valley. God was restoring things in my life better than they were then before I walked into prison. I actually had a real life. So things are going good. Patty and the 2 boys and myself, we've got a nice house in Apple Valley and stuff. I was a heavy equipment operator by trade. That's what I did my whole life for work, was heavy equipment operator. And anybody that knows me knows that I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love to fish, I love to hunt, I love motorcycles. Well, one morning, it was December 3rd, 2014, I'm getting ready to go ice fishing. And Patty and Noah were out running errands, and Caden, I think, was in first grade at the time. He was in school, so I'm home alone, and I'm putting my socks on, getting ready, and all of a sudden I get this pain in my chest, and it was serious pain. And I said, oh shoot. That's what I said. That's the word we're using today, folks. Oh, shoot. I said, oh, shoot. So I dialed 911. I'm not going to dial 911 unless I absolutely know I'm dying. So I'm sitting on the couch like an idiot with my thumb over the other one thinking, I'll get it pushed if I have to, you know. And then all of a sudden I remembered that the doors were all locked. Well, if I have to hit the other one, I don't want the EMTs to have to kick my door in. So I got up to unlock my front door, and I made it about 5 feet, and I collapsed. My legs wouldn't work. I couldn't walk. My legs were like useless. And I said that word again, oh, shoot. I crawled over, I unlocked the front door, sat back up against the wall, and I hit the other one. I thought, well, I might die, but my door is going to live. Well, I never forget the EMT, young gal, she came and did an EKG on me and stuff. And she come up to me, and she goes, great news, Dennis. You didn't have a heart attack. So I looked at her, I said, well, then I'm going fishing. And that's when the argument started. She wanted me to go to the hospital, and I wanted to go fishing. So we're arguing back and forth, and finally she goes, Dennis, obviously something happened. You dialed 911. And I looked at her, I said, well, maybe it was gas. And she goes, you're sitting on the floor. Well, then my wife came home. And if you're married, I don't have to explain why, but then I decided to go to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, the EMT goes, it's a good thing you're going to the hospital. I said, why is that? She goes, your blood pressure is dropping steadily. Well, I get to the hospital. They do it in Burnsville Ridges in Burnsville. And they do a CT scan of me. And right away, the doctor comes up to me and he goes, Dennis, you need to get to the University of Minnesota right now. They said the issue is the helicopter's out and we don't believe we have time to get another one here, so we're going to drive you. Well, I'm in the back, and that's what his voice told me. His eyes told me I was already dead, and I knew it. I knew I was dying. Well, I'm in the back of the ambulance, and the guy's sitting next to me waiting for me to do whatever you do when you die, you know, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to talk to God about this. because I believe I'm not dying 1 second sooner than God tells me to. And I'm not going to live 1 second longer than he says. So I started talking to God, and I said, God, I said, if you want to bring me home, I said, I've had a good run. But then I've got control issues, so I started explaining to God how this was going to all work. I said, if you bring me home, I read in the Bible where it says you're going to take care of the widows and the orphans. I said, well, I'm going to have a widow and 2 very young orphans. I said, so if you bring me home, then we're going to have a talk. But then I told him, I said, if you want me to stay, I'll stay and do whatever you ask. Well, obviously, I made it to the hospital. And the surgeon, and it was complete chaos. They weren't expecting a live person to show up. I like to do that to people, But the surgeon, he meets me at the ambulance, and we're running to the operating room. And now for a heart surgeon, I thought this guy would be a little smarter, because he was asking me some really dumb questions. He goes, Dennis, if I have to replace your valve, what kind do you want? I looked at him, I said, one that works. I mean, is it a V-twin or the Milwaukee 8? I don't know. I said, I want one that works. Little did I know I was in for a 14-hour open heart surgery. They took veins out of my legs, rebuilt all the arteries around my heart. My surgeon told me I'm the first guy he's seen survive what I had. My aorta split going into my heart. I was in a 14-hour surgery. They had my heart stopped for 6 hours. I was in a coma for 4 or 5 days. It was a tough recovery. In fact, I had like 3 more ambulance rides to the hospital after that. If you were a betting person, you would probably bet that I wasn't going to make it. But I did survive. And one night after that, I'm at River Valley Churches on a Saturday night. And as I'm leaving, Pastor Pam comes up to me, and she starts talking to me. She goes, Dennis, are you ever going to be able to do construction again? And I didn't think there was a chance I was ever going to do construction again, but I looked at it, I said, I don't know, Pam. And she goes, well, you've been working with these men for the last, 3-4 years. She goes, I always thought you would make a good pastor. Now, those are words I never dreamed somebody would say to me, that I'd make a good pastor. But when she said it, she kind of lit a spark in me. So I went home that night. I talked to some of the pastors at church, and I'm not a school type guy, but I thought I could do online courses, especially with my heart condition at that time. I couldn't do nothing else but sit at home. So there's these online courses through the AG that you can take to become a pastor. Well, they were like, I don't know, $115, $120 a piece. The problem was Patty was a stay-at-home mom, and my temporary disability from my union paid about half of our mortgage. So you don't have to be an accountant major to understand our finances were going down. Well, I looked in the checkbook, and I think we had like $140 in there. And that was like in the middle of the month, and that was all we had till the first of the month when I got my next disability check. So I bought the first course, and then I told my wife. Sometimes I wish God would talk to us both at the same time. But I told Patty, I said, if this is God, he'll make a way. I said, if it's my flesh, I said, we're going to be at your mom and dad's a lot for dinner. Well, the next morning, Sarah and Tony come over, and I told them what I signed up for the night before, and I didn't say anything about our financial hardship. I just said I want to become a pastor. Tony's first words out of his mouth were, let Sarah and I bless you and pay for all the courses. He wrote me a check for all of them, even the one I paid for the night before. I started to give, I'm what they call an iron marshmallow, tough as steel but soft as a marshmallow. I cry. And I started crying, and I looked at Patty. I said, I think God just spoke. Well, I did heal up. I got my pastor credentials in 2016. I went back working heavy equipment. And I always knew God had more for me than running a big backhoe. But part of the reason I didn't go into ministry was, how do I tell my all-Catholic family, and there's good Catholic churches out there, but my mom doesn't understand what I do to this day. How do I tell them that I quit a really good paying job to start a ministry that I have no idea how I'm going to support my family? They would have thought I was nuts. So that's why I kept arguing for 2 years with God about starting a ministry. Well, one year I go in for my cardiologist yearly checkup, and usually it was an echo, and she'd say, I'll see you next year. Well, this time, she goes, Dennis, I want you to have a CT scan done. So I go have a CT scan done. And then she goes, Dennis, I want you to go to University of Minnesota and have an angiogram. That's where they run the wire into your heart and release the dye and stuff like that. And I look at her, I said, Doc, what's going on? And she goes, I told you they rebuilt the arteries around my heart. She said, all the grafts are closing, and we don't know why. And I think to myself, man, that means they got to bust me open again. I barely made it the first time. I really didn't want to go through this surgery a second time. But I had a couple weeks to think about it, and all of a sudden, bang, I had a great idea. I thought, if I have to have another procedure, that's going to be my excuse to everybody about going into ministry. I can't do construction no more, and the only thing I'm qualified for is ministry, you know. Well, we go up and have the test, and Patty and I are sitting in the room. I'm laying in the bed, and a surgeon comes up to me all smiling. She goes, Dennis, she goes, your arteries look awesome. She goes, I wish mine looked as good as yours. I got mad at her. I said, what am I doing all these tests for and stuff like that? She took my excuse away to go into ministry. And so I'm mad and stuff, and she goes, Dennis, this is the best news ever. You don't have to have open heart surgery again. Well, she ended up leaving the room that day, and I think she looked at me like I had 3 heads, and well, my wife always looks at me like that, so it didn't matter. But I'm laying there in bed, and all of a sudden I got this, I didn't hear a voice, but I just felt God kind of telling me, Dennis, if you're going to go into ministry, you're going into ministry because I'm calling you to it, not because of some medical thing. Don't you read your Bible? I raise people from the dead. Well, we left the hospital, and about a few days later, Patty knew what was going on in my head about that. I just felt called to start a ministry. I'm with a pastor friend of mine, and he's praying over me. And when he's praying over me, I heard that voice again. And all it said was, All In Ministries. And he got done praying for me, and I looked at Pastor Dave. I said, I'm supposed to start All In Ministries. He goes, well, if that's what God's calling you to, he said, you're wasting your time arguing. Well, I went home. I had to talk to my wife. Like I said, God doesn't talk to us both at the same time sometimes. And I said, Patty, I've got a few questions for you. I said, do you believe I'm a man of God doing the best I can? Believe me, you can ask Bob. I am not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I do the best I can. And she goes, yes. I said, do you believe men that are struggling, that's where my ministry lies? And she said, absolutely. And I said, I've got one more question. And she started going about our finances, and everything she said was legit. But I looked at her, I said, Patty, I didn't ask the question yet. So she got quiet, and I said, do we trust God? And I could tell she started to get amped up again, and I said, well, Patty, this is a yes or no question. If somebody asks you, do you trust God? There's only 2 viable answers. It's yes or no. Not yes when, yes but, yes if. It's yes or no. And she looked at me, she goes, yes. I told her what I wanted to do. She said, go for it. 3 days later, I called my boss, and I quit my job. If the worship team wants to start coming up, Bob, they can start coming up. But I quit my job. Now, you guys, I'm a construction worker, ex-con. I've got no idea what it takes to start a nonprofit, no idea about a board of directors. I have no idea about any of this stuff, and I quit my job before any money was coming in. I just knew this is what God wanted. And God has taken care of this ministry for 8.5 years now. I work with men. My wife, we hired her over 3 years ago. She works with women. She's got over 16 years of sobriety. I've got over 21. We both know a little bit about addiction and what it takes to stay sober. God's plans are always bigger than ours. I'm not a speaker. I asked my wife, I get so nervous every time I have to talk. It just, we started a fishing division and all this stuff. I've got some brochures out there. I wrote a book called That Man Is Dead. I've got some copies left. I gave away quite a few this morning. They're free out there, so whoever gets to them first, they're free. Things are going beyond what I could have ever expected. Remember when I told you in the ambulance, I told God, if you want me to stay, I'll stay and do whatever you ask. I believe right now, this very second, I am doing exactly what God wants. I want to thank you for letting me come and share today.